Hello again. We're starting the second week of our drawing class. This week we're going to get into much more drawing. I wanted to start off this week talking about drawing materials and our first element of art, which is line. So, drawing materials. There are two main types of drawing materials, dry media and liquid media. And then we also have alternative media. We're going to use all three types of these drawing materials this semester. We're going to look at in detail at a few of the different types of drawing materials in this PowerPoint. So we'll look at graphite, metal point, charcoal, crayon pencil, and chalk under dry media. And then under liquid media, we're going to look at pen and ink and brush and ink. And then we'll also look at a few alternative surfaces. So just a couple important vocabulary terms to start off. This is what helps define different types of drawing materials. The first one is pigment. Oftentimes we think of pigment when it comes to paint, but any type of drawing material is going to have a pigment, whether it is black or red or bright yellow. And pigment is the color material made from various organic or chemical substances. So for example, the pigment in something like charcoal, which is black, is going to be carbon, so it's an organic material. The second vocabulary term is binder. A binder is the substance that causes the particles of pigment to adhere to one another and to a support. So the binder is actually a very important element of a drawing material because without the binder, it wouldn't adhere to the paper. The third vocabulary term is ground. And ground is a preliminary coat of paint, usually white, sometimes colored, applied to the support for a painting or drawing. We don't obviously always use these for drawing, but there's certain circumstances in which ground is necessary. The first example of that is metal point. Metal point is one of the original drawing materials that we see starting in the Renaissance. Metal point was actually had to be prepared with a ground, very white, chalky ground called gesso. And metal point is the predecessor to the actual pencil. Metal point was used for underdrawings for paintings. It was also used for sketches that might later be made into etchings and used in books. And it was a piece of metal held inside of a little tiny holder. So kind of the same way that a pencil is a piece of graphite held inside of a wooden holder. Charcoal is one of the oldest drawing materials that we know. Examples of charcoal drawings can be found in caves dating back 30,000 years or more. Charcoal, as you can imagine, is naturally made. In essence, charcoal is wood that has been carbonized, heated in some way, and then can be used to draw on various types of supports. Now, you can actually you could use charcoal that you found out of an old fire, for example. But if anybody's ever tried to pick up a piece of charcoal and write with it, one of the problems is it's very scratchy because the wood itself hasn't been fully carbonized, so there's some hard, scratchy pieces of wood still left in it. The charcoal that you'll be using has been superheated in a kiln, so it's heated to a temperature where they know all of the wood will be carbonized. Now, some of you, as we start to use the charcoal, occasionally you'll actually get a piece of charcoal that isn't fully carbonized and kind of scratches or dents the paper. That's a common problem or that people have once they start drawing with the charcoal itself. So if you find one of those pieces, there's not much you can do other than break it, move further along in the piece of charcoal, or pick up a new piece of charcoal. Crayon and chalk is another type of drawing material that's very common. The example that you see here by Seurat is an example of a Conte crayon. Conte crayons are similar to charcoal, they're black, but they have the addition of a binder to it. So charcoal itself, as we start to work with it, you'll see uh, it doesn't have a binder built into it. What adheres it to the paper is the paper itself. You have to use a paper that has a tooth to it, so one that hasn't been cold, that hasn't been hot pressed. Hot pressed paper has a very smooth surface. Cold pressed paper actually has a tooth that the charcoal can pick up on. We'll talk some examples about that as we get more into charcoal. Um, but the charcoal adheres to the paper just by latching on to the tooth of the paper itself. Conte crayons have a waxy binder that adheres to the paper. So it's actually harder to erase, but it lasts longer. It's not quite as messy as charcoal. Very popular during the Impressionist period because it leaves this sort of stippled, textured look to it. Uh, Crayons themselves are another example of that same kind of binder. It has a pigment, a colored pigment, mixed with a wax. So Conte crayons, just regular crayons, have that in common. Now pastels are a type of chalk. Chalk, similar to charcoal, adheres to the paper through binding to the paper itself. So the paper has to have a textured surface for the chalk to be able to stick. And pastels, as you know, they're very sort of have a light version of it, so the chalk is actually mixed with the color pigment. There are different types of pastels, like oil pastels, that actually have that oily binder to help it adhere to the paper. Liquid media is the next type of media that we're going to talk about. And pen and ink also fall under liquid media, which, most of the time we don't think about a ballpoint pen as being a liquid media because it dries so quickly, but a pen has a little, when you take them apart, it has that well of ink that can be found underneath it. So in the case of a ballpoint pen, it has a ball that releases and slowly releases that liquid ink out onto the page so you could write with it. Other types of liquid ink, for example, like the Sharpie or Micron pen that you have in your kit, have a felt tip. So the felt tip is the reservoir that when you press it into the paper, it releases small amounts of ink. There's many different types of this, like the original, if you think about the feather quill, there's a little reservoir that's built into that when you press on the paper divides. And it's one of the reasons that ink is considered a drawing material, even if you're using a brush for it. It's because some of the purpose it originally served was for writing. What about an image like this? Would you consider this a drawing or a painting? Now there's acrylic paint used within it. You can see some examples of that. But there's also fine little lines, another example by this artist. We see little kind of detailed architectural drawings. Would this be considered a painting or a drawing? Well, there's not a right or wrong answer to this. And it's one of those debates that artists like to talk about on and on. You could argue that it's a painting, you could argue it's a drawing. But for the sake of what we're doing in here, we're going to kind of have a broad look at the use of ink and liquid media in drawing. One of the things that we're going to use this semester is brush and ink. Now, it's looking at this piece, would it be considered a painting or a drawing? We're going to consider it a drawing for one purpose alone, and that's that the artist used what's called a sumi ink brush. Sumi ink brushes were originally used for calligraphy, which are a form of writing. Artists during the Impressionists, very interested in Eastern styles of art making. They became very interested in the use of calligraphy brushes and started using them for drawings. So we're sort of looking back at that practice and thinking of them as a drawing material. although there's an equally convincing argument to be made that it's a painting material. Alternative media. So we kind of look back at some historical uses of drawing materials. Today, you see all kinds of different materials that could be used for drawing. This is an example of a graphite wall mural. Typically, we think of murals as being paintings. This was done with graphite powder using a paintbrush and also graphite for the smaller details, graphite pencils. So even though it's painted and also the details are drawn, and it's drawn on a wall, not a piece of paper. This is also considered in the practice of drawing. We can also think, a lot of times when we think about color, unfortunately, we don't get into color very much in this class. That's a drawing 2. We start getting into color and drawing into composition. But the practice of using color along with ink and other styles of mark making, including comic books or alternative media, also fits under that larger category of drawing. So now that we've talked about some of the different types of materials that you might use when drawing, we're going to talk a little bit about the elements of art. Some of you may have heard of these before. When we're talking about the visual elements of art, these are considered the building blocks of art. So we're going to touch on a few of these this semester. The elements of art are line, shape, mass, light, value, color, texture, and space. We're actually going to touch on each one of these semester other than color, as I just mentioned earlier, because color is sort of left off for drawing and composition. So as you can imagine, the first element that we're going to start with and we're going to start drawing with is line. Can any of you guess why we're going to start with line? It's one of the simplest types of elements of art to work with. So the definition of line is a path traced by a moving point. If you were in a math class, you would probably hear that definition. You have 2 points that are connected. Line is one-dimensional and can vary in width, direction, and length. As an artist, you're really going to focus in on the idea that it can vary by width, direction, and length. Lines often define the edges of a form. This is something that we're going to work on very early on. We're going to talk about it today. It's called contour line drawing, but you can think about the idea that you're looking at the edges of a form. Lines can also be horizontal, vertical, diagonal, straight, curved, thin, or thick. We're really going to think about how we kind of stretch that definition of line, and we're going to play with our drawing materials to try to get the most amount of variety that we can out of them. Line can also lead your eye around the composition and can communicate information with their character and direction. So we're going to look at some examples of that. Let's look at this piece by Keith Haring. It's a very simple piece at first glance. In what ways is line used? Well, one, we can see that line is used to define the edges of the shapes. We see that kind of weird creature, man, mermaid, angel thing in the air. Yes, that we can see that the line has been defined around the outside edges of it. We also see that little dolphin there squeaking up at him. So it's defining edges on things like that. What about the waves? When we think about water, we're not really defining edges. It's more defining the movement, right? So line there, we know that it's choppy waves. It's not a nice smooth ocean. What about those other lines that you see around that central figure? Those little wiggly lines coming off of the edges there and coming off of the top of the head. You can kind of think about them like stink lines, right? Or, movement lines. When we think about something like stink lines, right? You can't visibly see something sting, right? And that's what Herring kind of talks about here. He's talked about this piece and said that those wiggly lines are meant to represent spiritual energy. So it's almost defining something that you cannot see. So that's an interesting part that line could do, even though this is kind of a simplistic version of it. But that line could define things that cannot be seen. How about the use of line in this piece? So we talked about line defining edges, right? So we see all those different kind of circles and shapes and those other things. But this piece has much more dimension than the previous piece, right? It almost feels like we're moving back into space. And that's another thing that line can do. Line can create dimension. So if we follow, for example, that ruler line back as it goes into space and it gets smaller, we feel like we can actually move back into the dimension of this piece. Same thing as we look at the left. As those lines converge back together, we feel like the space is getting smaller or there's some depth over there on that left-hand side. So this artist is very interested in creating depth in their piece through line. This last example of line, we can see but visual movement. So the artist is using it to move the viewer's eye throughout the piece. Not sure if I can. Oop. Hopefully, just realized I wish I could make some little marks on here, but we'll have to go with me explaining it. If you start here on the railing, we go down along the railing, move over across to the women, up, back and forth, back along the railing, back into the back where those little women are. This is what's called visual flow. The line is actually moving our eye throughout the piece. So we're not just staying in one spot. The line creates an interesting composition. So we talked about what line can do. Now we're going to talk what kind of emotions line can portray. And different types of line can give different meanings. So the first thing we're going to think about is horizontal line. Horizontal lines suggest a feeling of rest or repose because they're parallel to the earth and at rest. If you think about it, when you're sleeping, what kind of line do you make? Well, most of us make a horizontal line unless you're a really crazy sleeper, or if you're one of my twins, they seem to sleep with their butt up in the air all the time, so they're not quite creating a horizontal line. So horizontal lines typically give a feeling of rest or repose. Oftentimes, horizontal lines represent a nice, peaceful landscape. You can kind of think about horizontal lines as being one of the most representing the earth or things that are at rest. If we look at this piece, we see some horizontal lines, but does this piece feel at rest? What exactly is giving it that movement? If you look at the oar and the arms of the men in the boat, those are no longer horizontal lines, right? Those are, so I'm going to skip a slide, diagonal lines. And diagonal lines help to convey a feeling of movement. Objects in a diagonal position are unstable because they're neither vertical or horizontal. They feel like they're about to fall over or they're already in motion. So if you look at the image here to the right, we can see the diagonal movements of those ships let us know that there's a big storm. The waves are diagonal lines. Even the people sort of pressed up against the wind. We can't physically see the wind, but we know there's wind just because the way the bodies are sort of moving diagonally against it. What is the one thing that seems stable in this image? If you look there in the background, that very stable lighthouse, sort of standing strong despite all that wind, that is a vertical line. And vertical lines often communicate a sense of height, of stability, Because they extend upward towards the sky, they sometimes suggest spirituality rising beyond human reach towards the heavens. So vertical is very stable and strong. What about this piece? What kind of lines do we see present? Do you think that this is a image showing calm, stable waters, or desperation, chaos, even violence? So sharply curved or twisted lines can convey turmoil, chaos. For example, in the sculpture on the right, we can see those intense lines wrapping around that body, suggesting some kind of struggle, stranglehold. The more chaotic they are, the more that you can create that sense of drama. What type of line is implied line? Implied line means lines that you cannot see but that we know are there. Does everybody see the S in this piece? Now the S isn't actually a line. The S is created where all those other lines stop. So implied line is something that we know exists by connecting the dots. There's also something called implied shapes we'll get to actually later on this week. So one of the first drawings we're going to do right now is a contour line drawing. Now, contour line drawings imply that we're creating shapes through line. Just to give you an example here, this is an outline versus a contour line. Now the outline, as you can see there on the left, means just the outer shapes. So when we draw them, in this example, it's as if you have each little individual piece of the dress. So if I was just to draw a simple circle, that would be the outline of the circle. Contour line implies that there's some sort of dimension to that shape. So it's not just showing the outside edges, it's also showing the interior edges. This is going to be important in our drawings that we're going to do today. We're not just trying to draw the outside edges of the form, we're trying to draw the contour lines. So we're also looking at those interior lines that are going to help us create a three-dimensional shape. And you can kind of think about it as this piece, that we're not just we're trying to create some dynamic movement in the piece. So if we were drawing for example, the outside edges of these glasses, they would be very flat shapes. We are also thinking about trying to capture those interior shapes too. So sometimes that means a nice solid line, as you can see there, but sometimes it might mean a fine, thin, almost invisible line, as you can see along some of the edges of those glasses. So how you decide to create that line is what's going to make an interesting drawing. So sometimes that line could be very strong and thick. Other times it could be very thin and fragile. Sometimes you'll see a very hard edge. Sometimes you'll see a nice, fine little floaty detail. So you're going to think about different ways that you could represent contour through line. So we don't just want one line that's all exactly the same looking. You're going to try to press with your charcoal pencil harder or softer, or using the edge of your pencil. You're going to see how many different types of line you can make in your contour line drawings. All right, so that is sort of our little intro to line, intro to materials. You're going to have some activities to complete this week as well, thinking about line. Make sure you do all the discussion posts along with the assignments this week. All right, thank you.